Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next edition of the Showcase Shop Talk. I am Sophie White. I'll be one of your co-hosts today, and I manage the Showcase program at EDUCAUSE.
And I'm Jenay Robert. I'll also be co-hosting. I'm a senior researcher at EDUCAUSE.
Great. And then with us today, we are really excited to have our guest, James Hutson, lead XR Disruptor at Lindenwood University, and also department head for art history. And also Sandeep Sidhu, who is the Chief Information Officer at Emily Carr University, and also calls herself a digital janitor. Not exactly sure yet what that means, so we'll talk about that. So thank you, James and Sandeep, for being with us today.
Great to be here.
Pleasure.
I am curious, can we start by talking about what a digital janitor is?
I knew that was coming. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you're watching us. I will start with sort of also acknowledging the lands that I'm dialing in from. We are Emily Carr Art and Design University based in Vancouver, Canada, and we are so blessed to be on the local nations' lands of Squamish, Leathertooth, and the Musqueam Nations. And it is what a pride I feel. I'm fortunate every single day to be here. And the term digital janitor, actually, I don't know who I stole it from. It was one of the aspiring CIOs that, as an aspiring CIO, I was following a number of leaders in higher ed, and someone probably said it in one of their presentations. So I'm like, you know what? 90% of my job feels that way, which is really being the steward of digital and really helping the university think through some compliance and some risks that they haven't thought through. And technology is so exciting. And as we go into AI, it is so exciting. It feels like you're high on a drug, but you forget there is a fallout. And when we're done with that high, someone has to come in, help with the cleanup, help settle down, manage the risks. So that term has stuck with me for a while, and by no means it's a reflection of lack of trust or anything. I just find it's a great conversation starter. And as stewards of that data and thinking about the implications, I feel privileged that I'm in this role to help the institution figure those challenges out. And also then on the flip side, how do we use that as an opportunity? So as if we're in the space of a university being the innovators, lots of these technologies and digital trends can really help us leapfrog.
Excellent. Can I ask Sandeep a question to follow with that? Yeah. So we're having lots of conversations, and I'm sure you have been rapidly trying to figure out the best way to address these changes that are coming fast and furious. And I love the way that you talked about the kind of high, because I remember we were doing studies 2 years ago and making our own algorithms and doing these pedagogical test cases in creative writing and art and design, et cetera. And then generative AI hit last summer, and then the writing hit as far as OpenAI's stable model in November of 22. And I remember it was like a kid at Christmas. Or like, oh my God, it can do this, it can do this, it can do this, right? And then, by the time I got to January, like, oh, it was such a letdown. I was like, oh, it can't do that. Oh no. And then it's like the stages of grief, right? That being, it's like eventually we led to acceptance. And I think that's kind of the phase you're talking about. I did have a question about the approach that your institution is taking and you yourself spearheading it. We noticed there was a shift recently, and I don't know if you have seen it, but I've seen even TikTok videos and those on LinkedIn about how all these startups, which are piggybacking on OpenAI's platform and their APIs, their enterprise models, as soon as they go down, everyone freaks out because without that, it kind of crashes, right, in this way. So, but in addition to that, what we were seeing and you can tell me if you're seeing a similar trend, was a move from large, all-encompassing solutions, that would handle things, student information systems, learning management systems, et cetera, to many smaller solutions that do very specific things and have these little subscription fees that kind of add up. So instead of having a large contract with one provider that does everything, we now have like 20 that do very, very specific little things. So are you finding that to be true?
I'm certainly seeing that from my own perspective as well as my peers in Canada. And to be honest, this idea came before AI took this hype cycle, went on to this hype cycle, the idea of microservices. I actually learned this idea from someone, another individual I look up to. I met through EDUCAUSE, Michael Berman. As I was transitioning into new CI role, one of the things in my portfolio was to look at the ERPs, which is these behemoth systems, CRMs that tend to, and I think most of them do a really good job, but they're trying to be the Walmart. They're trying to offer everything to everybody. And now we're moving to these very boutique services and take what we need, but what? And may I share a challenge that I see? We have to shift the capabilities and skill sets internally, because now what is our team going to offer is more integration, the middleware. We are now just not supporting the system in terms of making it work. We have this behemoth, we're configuring it, customizing it. So I feel, yes, that's the direction we're going, but we need to rethink how our teams are structured as well.
That's a great insight. Thank you.
It makes me think of, in this showcase, we'll talk about the EDUCAUSE top 10. So if you were at the annual conference, Susan Grajek discussed the top 10. And this year, the theme was institutional resilience, which I think is really interesting as we're thinking about, all of these boutique type of solutions that are adapting quickly and we're happy to change as a result of them. But how at the same time do you build resilience within the institution across multiple levels to make sure that you can adapt to these things as they come at you? I don't know, Jenay, if you have anything to add to that based on the research that we're doing, but I just think it's such an interesting conflict sometimes between innovation and this idea of building up resilience.
Yeah, and also related to the top 10, I think thinking about our sort of desperate need at this point for unifying our data structures and our approaches to data governance at our institutions, which ties in, it's all related, right? I mean, that ties into institutional resilience and so forth as well. But I think that this idea of microservices, and trying to balance the sort of grain size of the data collection methods happening at our institutions, it starts to really balloon that problem too. So I'm curious about and for the two of you, I mean, what sort of approaches you're taking in that regard as well?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because that's what we saw over the summer in the hype cycle, as Sandeep and Sophie were talking about, was this overinflated promise and an AI gold rush that we're going to have in the first fiscal quarter, after July 1, a huge boon for industry, and it didn't materialize. And so we saw the same thing here as we adopted, and we're training our folks, weekly across different areas and different offices, and then trying to also help the community. But what we found was they were very hesitant, and the general feedback we received, and it was confirmed in the Harvard Business Review report that came out 2 weeks ago, was that they know it's really important. They know they really need to adopt it and get on board because the future is already, upon us, and these are a reality, not something that's going to be coming. But that they're afraid if they taught their people how to use it, they would, and they would use it poorly, or in an inexperienced fashion, inadvertently, get the company on the wrong side of a lawsuit, like we've seen, who don't understand necessarily how it works. But then secondly, data privacy was the other big one, that they didn't know what types of information they could put into, once again, the training of these large language models, and especially the publicly available ones. So everyone was waiting for the enterprise solutions to come out, which they finally, released those, last month. But so data privacy seems to be what most are hung up on, especially fiscal management, fiscal affairs. That seems to be the one area that we're kind of grappling with most, right? And that's also what kind of slows it down as far as, financial aid packaging, distribution of funds, releasing them, et cetera. But then the second thing, of course, is going to be FERPA and HIPAA, right? So as far as student privacy, protecting that specific information, but then knowing what is already out there and how to anonymize the data, and then how to, once again, protect that. So we're currently working through that. We set aside a separate team just under IT for AI specifically to start breaking up the smaller units that Sandeep was talking about, to be more agile as we move into this new era. But I'm sure she has a much better perspective as a CIO.
Well, I should have also said I by no means even, I think I'm a beginner in learning about AI. That comes back to the other operational duties that we hold on. And as much as we would love to leverage the power of these new technologies, I'm certainly not even there. So James, thanks for saying that, because I've been thinking I need to put a caution out there. I'm still the new kid on the block. I'm still figuring it out myself. But there's certainly wealth of knowledge in the CIO network that I've been leaning on. But I loved what you said about privacy. I think that's a space. So I'm going to take this into two directions. One is the privacy from a compliance perspective. So what we are expected to deliver, particularly around student data. When we look at student data being hosted in small number of systems, your risk is also lower. So when we talk about the behemoths, now you have one or two. And when you expand it to microservices, the risk profile is going to change. So let's think about that. Second aspect to that is most of these startups are still building their business. And most of the time, they're not going to think about compliance. They just don't have the capacity. Not that they're being intentional. They don't have the capacity. They're still building, and they're still at an idea stage, and they want to pilot. They're going to test it out. So I'm seeing a number of these startups saying, look, we're just starting with this. Work with us, and then we will expand. Some will end up going there, and I think some of these will end up merging as organizations, perhaps. That's just typically what happens in organizations. But that is a deter for us in terms of privacy. How far do we want to go to make that commitment as well? So perhaps the space that I think about is where there is lesser risk. So we're working with non-student data. We're working with some data that is perhaps publicly available. How about data around our FTE numbers? Could we use AI or any new technologies on that publicly available data? And I think that's an amazing space to look at. Most universities have institutional research teams. I think they can leverage this really, really well as well. I'm going to also add another big sort of concern that I have, and coming from Canada, most of these solutions are being US sort of the powerhouse for software development. I think there's a lot of presence in Canada as well. But if you look at any of the CRM or ERP solutions out there, they're based in the US. And often what we are seeing is when they're developing a particular solution, they're not thinking about the taxation process here. Or I actually bumped into somebody from Australia. They were having the same thing. Taxation in Australia, any other country, is quite different. So now we come into this space of very small solution being built for perhaps a very niche market. So I think the space is going to develop over the next 5 years in many different ways, where it will be very much focused by perhaps presence globally, or it could be solving one problem. And if we go back 20 years ago, that's how the ERP spaces were. And I think we've now got this very solid space where you can name the top 5. I'm not sure if we can name the top 5 right now in the AI space.
No, I love
No, definitely not.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just saying, yeah, definitely not.
No, I wanted to build upon what Cindy mentioned in that there are some amazing things happening north of the border in as far as the tech area. That's when I started out in this current role of setting up a research lab and integrating XR across the institution and partnering. Most of the best companies were in Canada. And I still work with them. And actually one of them is with the University of Laval in Quebec. We just published one on using VR today to support employability of those diagnosed with autism. So some amazing things happening. But I talked to them like, how come you're not doing this? Like, well, that's it. It's amazing. They come up with all of this, but there are all these additional roadblocks we don't think of in order to actually take advantage of it. The second part I wanted to bring up is what kind of came up in the dialogue surrounding AI, and that's going to be, expectation of personal data privacy, right? As far as, how these things are trained, what you're putting out there, how it's used, et cetera, which was very interesting to me because it echoed the same concerns going back to the early days of Google and social media and these others, because that's how they were trained as well, and built these large data sets. But what I wanted to kind of point out, I think this also can kind of springboard us to some of the challenges of institutional resiliency when it comes to retaining faculty and staff. And we have, of course, hemorrhaging staff, across the nation at record rates. And there's no, of course, we know why. But what we find first is, the ability to use, or offer up one's data, the expectation of privacy. So what we find is that lawmakers actually grew up, and those that are actually trying to regulate a lot of this technology in a time in which privacy was possible, right? So, you could live off the grid. You didn't have a cell phone. You didn't have a social media account. You didn't put this information out, publicly. But then we're talking about Gen Z and now Gen Alpha, which is the cohort entering now into college. They never knew a time, right, without cell phones and constantly knowing exactly what their friends were having for dinner and sharing every moment of their lives. So this notion of privacy is entirely different. So we need to take that into account in talking with faculty and staff and their expectations and why they see, a lot of these tools as potentially harmful and dangerous. There was actually an AI ethics panel I was watching right before this. And that was one of the main things that was brought up is, how do we teach children how to use this, responsibly? My son talks about Pokemon, and the different health stats and everything, for hours if he could, with Pi and these other personal assistants, but kind of educating them. But then the disconnect between, the generation teaching and entrusted as stewards for the college experience, and then the experience actually those coming right out of high school with these tools, right? Which of course is going to become even more prevalent in secondary education as Google Chromebooks are now going to have generative writing tools built in. So it's going to be in Google Classroom, right? Which means that K through 12 is going to hit first. So when they get to us, we need a kind of a plan in order to deal with that. But I'm very, very sympathetic. And I think what we're not talking enough about, we had this great resignation, of course, that happened right after the pandemic. But look at the timeline of how quickly we're speeding up, right? So in the entire history of ed tech, right, the last 2 decades or even the last decade represents almost all of it, right? So if you're thinking about the advances. So from Google in 1998 to Wikipedia to social media to MOOCs to these learning management systems, right, which we didn't have when I started teaching 2 decades ago, right? So I was teaching on slide carousels that actually had to change the light bulbs in, right, for projectors. So that's how and that's a pretty short lifespan when it comes to history of higher education. But then you're talking about people that were taught and trained, right, in graduate school to deliver content in a particular way, right? So you need to be a good lecturer, you need to be a good teacher, you need to be a good pedagogue, you need to learn how to, project and with confidence, be the sage on the stage, etc. And then the pandemic hit, and that model no longer worked. Most in the country did try to maintain that model by just doing what we're doing now live in the same time they would have class and just talking to Zoom screens. But once the pandemic ended, students realized what good online education was, and that requires a complete different mentality of how to approach, your role in teaching and learning, your role in assessment, your role in course design and material. So we asked everyone in the country and the world, right, to learn how to teach in this new way, and many said no, because of course, that's if they didn't have the right support, the right network, the right professional development, it wasn't feasible in many instances. But then just think about it. A year and a half later after that happened, generative AI hit, and we're telling them now you have to completely change again, right? So resiliency among just teaching staff in general in higher education needs to be foregrounded more here. And what we're seeing in our research across the nation and internationally is administration is primarily treating the latest emergent ed tech kind of crisis as they see it as an undergraduate teaching and learning problem, and are passing the buck off to faculty saying, you figure out what you want to do with it, you make up your own policy, we're staying out of it. But they're not seeing it as a graduate student issue or concern or challenge or opportunity, and not a research one either, right? So they're not seeing we have to fundamentally change earlier on how we're training people now in graduate school, because they're going to be teaching this next generation very differently of how to use these tools and how to gain knowledge, how to create and generate new knowledge, how that knowledge is shared and stored, etc. So just wanted to kind of bring that as well to the forefront with resiliency and consideration, because that's something you would be very aware of, Sandy, in your role.
May I pose what I think from my perspective is a bit of a loaded question, but I'm sure it's not for you, James. You do this every single day. How do we then prepare our faculty for this big change? We all talk about change readiness, change management. This is going to shift their jobs dramatically. It's shifting already. And there's enough already on their plates. There were times we're not using PowerPoints. And here we are now. All these tools have become utilities for them. So how do we, rather than, put this back on them, how do we work with them? Because I think one of the lost opportunities is here. How do we use this as part of our relationship building to support them in this process?
Yes, exactly. And so we've done a lot of interinstitutional research from faculty, staff, and students at both community colleges, teaching institutions, R1s. And amazingly, we're seeing fairly consistent evidence and data being gathered from each one. The first and foremost thing, if you look at what our research has showed us, there are 3 indicators that will lead to the outcome of adopting these new tools and techniques in their workflow, their daily lives, their teaching, their jobs. And so the first one we have to get over, which I'm sure that many institutions had a policy that came out, which is a knee-jerk reaction of, we don't really know what to do with this yet, like New York banning it, in all the public schools. And then now everyone is doing a 180 and like, no, we're doing AI literacy. We're going all in with this, etc. They just don't know how as of yet. But so the first thing is for institutions to communicate clearly on their policies to their faculty and staff. That being, you can use it for this. They need basic AI literacy first. So HR also is behind them in being, if you use it for this task, you aren't going to be penalized in a particular way, or negative consequences will happen to you professionally. So that's kind of the first one, is messaging, right? Because right now the messaging is very unclear in most institutions as to what is permissible and what is not. They kind of are leaving it, don't ask, don't tell, kind of, in that way. So that's kind of step one, is being clear in messaging. And step two is going to be addressing the elephant in the room that everyone knows is there, but no one's talking about, and that is job displacement, job loss, being replaced, etc. So I remember that in 2017, a major survey in the U.S. found that Americans are more afraid of being replaced by robots than death. Right. So, and we still, the prevailing narrative of any technology, even what you saw with the presidential order that came out earlier this week, but it invoked a war act, right? Invoked once again that there's going to be threats and we need to protect ourselves against. It's not in most literature being framed in a positive way. Is what can we do? What can the benefits of society be? How can this help us with wicked problems? Climate change, poverty, the digital divide, etc. That's kind of left out of the narrative, because as human beings, we are inherently scared of the unknown. And if anyone says they know what's going to happen 5 years from now, they are lying, because there are too many variables. And so that's scary. But that's the first thing we have to address, is job security. That being, okay, let's talk about how, number one, you can use it. We're going to give you the training to do so. Number two, you still have a job, right? So let's just start with that, because, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if they don't feel safe and secure in their job, they're going to be very resistant to any type of training or change. And that leads to another thing we've just found, which is circling research communities, is we have a name for it now. We didn't 2 years ago, and that's AI guilt. That being, even the faculty that I work with that are very pro AI, they know their students need to learn it. We're doing studies every week in multiple classes, hundreds of students. They're teaching all their students how to use it, but they don't want to use it, for particular aspects of their job, because they were trained that in order to do a good job as a professional, say, as an English professor, you need to spend X amount of time on each paper and give certain types of feedback, right? Generally 15 minutes per paper. And if you have, 60 of those per week, they're doing hundreds of hours of grading. And it is, but even though they know how, I've co-published, papers with them on how to automate the feedback process very effectively, efficiently, and to give them great feedback and do it instantaneously. The AI guilt is stopping. Same thing with students. Like, well, this feels creepy. This feels wrong. It's too easy. This shouldn't work that way. And that leads to the second one. And then I can stop anytime, but it was trying to answer your question. That being, number one, just showing everyone that they're supportive, that's non-punitive as far as this is concerned, because most of the policies that came out, including our own here at my institution, was first and foremost, to protect individuals. So I went to HR. I said, look, we need something. There were all those lawsuits coming out over the summer. And it wasn't due to malicious intent of individuals, like the lawyer in New York or the journalist in Annapolis. They just thought that it worked in a way that it doesn't, right? It's not Google. It wasn't pulling, at that time live from a database of law briefs, right? And so they were getting sued for that. But the messaging going out is primarily one of protecting the institution, right, from any type of liability and litigation, right? We're not hearing a lot of messaging in general in higher education about, let's support this. We'll do it. Of course, we'll show you how to do it ethically and responsibly, show you what it can and can't do, etc. But we need to show that we're supportive of it. So that's kind of number one is, if you don't have that broad-based kind of understanding. I still have faculty that think that their computers on campus are being monitored and that they're being flagged by HR if they use any AI tool. And I'm just like, this is not no. So, but they feel that way, right, Sandeep? Yeah, it's like Big Brother is watching me. So that's kind of step one, right? So they're scared to even touch it. So AI literacy is impossible. Step two is going to be what we found in our studies is the second indicator, and that is going to involve identity loss. This is true for faculty, student, and staff. We first started noticing this in creative writing and the creative disciplines that we were looking at, in that if we were training them to use a tool that does what they vocationally thought they were preparing to do, they were very hostile towards it, right? No, it's stealing, it's taking art from creatives. It's once again taking jobs. And then finally, they just started saying in later studies, what's the point of any of this, right? Why am I even going to college if it could do this, right? So we're not communicating clearly as to what we're doing. So that's kind of the next step is, here's what you're actually getting out of what I'm teaching you. It's not just Shakespeare. It's not just memorizing the bones of the body, right? We're learning these other metacognitive strategies, these other NACE competencies, here's what we're doing, right, with this. We're not doing that, right? So because we weren't trained to do that. But we have to address identity loss. That being, if I'm not a poet, what am I? If I'm not a teacher, what am I? Right? And that's all of humanity. We're going to have to deal with that because our identities are going to shift, and what we think we do informs who we are. Right? And that's not going to be the case. The third one is specific to faculty, and that's going to be, you'll notice that most people that took an early lead in adopting these tools up to almost a year ago now. Yeah, we're November 1st, right? A year ago, right? It's only been a year. Just think of everything that happened in the last year. The ones that adopted it first were not in computer science, right? So they were in other disciplines because we found out later on when they finally we started doing research and survey, that they felt they were the subject matter experts, and that's not real AI. I understand AI. I teach machine learning. I teach, once again, data science. I know I'm the expert, therefore I don't need to worry about this new stuff. That's just, passing fact. But what that behind that posturing is this notion of, okay, I'm losing my subject matter expertise. So it's different, right? It's professional identity versus personal identity. So those are the things that we're going to have to consider with the trainings, if that helps answer your question, Sandeep. Because
James,
go ahead.
Sorry, you really touched on a couple of things that I think are really interesting in terms of the conversations I've been having at conferences and conversations like this around AI. Everyone wants to know what makes this so different. What is it sort of hitting on in our cultural norms or our personal norms? And a couple of things that you've sort of touched on here. And I think also maybe we talked about this as part of the generative AI action plan, which James, you were a part of, but that this technology has a way of pushing back on the foundation of what we think it means to be human. So our ability to be creative and make new things and so if something is sort of simulating our thinking, what are we really? And I think I see a lot of discomfort just around that. And then the other piece that you sort of touched on was the idea that humans really don't have a great way to deal with exponential change. So we want everything to be sort of linear. We want to know what the next step is. We want to be able to see a clear trajectory and a clear path forward. But when it comes to what's happening now in the AI space, things are changing so rapidly that I think it kind of throws people off kilter. And that makes sense. We don't know how to deal with things changing so quickly. It doesn't happen that often in our culture and our society.
And that's what you brought up, that being, in the past, we would say, we have a plan. We know what's going to happen up to 2030. We had the Stanford 2018 800 AI study or AI 800 study. And what it projected was, a very clear plan, which made everyone comfortable, generally because those that were making the plan and those that were doing the research had jobs on one end, right? So they said that, it's going to first automate manual, repetitive, low-skilled tasks, right? And it's going to then maybe 5 years later work its way up to lower-level white-collar jobs, and then at the very end, the creative field, because that's the hardest thing to do, they thought. It was the opposite, right? It started off with AI art generators and social media in 2022, the summer of 2022. They were everywhere. So once again, it started with art, right? So that threw the predictive modeling entirely out the window. And so we have to start from scratch. And it's developing at such a rapid pace, we don't have enough data yet in order to project that far. We don't know the impact it's going to have, but you're absolutely right.
I'll also add too, I'm thinking about the generative AI action plan. I know Jenay and James, you worked pretty closely on that one. And I think one thing that helped me as someone who's maybe not daily in the weeds with AI as much was seeing this goal for the future state of AI outlined and then actions of how we may get there. And I was really inspired by it. I think I've heard more about this conversation of, the scary aspects of AI, the loss of identity, the job security, et cetera. But if you have a chance to read the action plan, there are some things related to access and accessibility of education technology. Processes and outputs are equal and unbiased. Obviously, that will take some work to get to, but in an ideal state, if we could do that, the power of these tools to enhance our experience as humans. It was also making me think of, and I'll add a disclaimer that I'm not done with this book yet. I'm currently reading Clara and the Sun. It's a fictional story, and it's actually centered around this character who's called an artificial friend, or an AF. And her name is Clara, and she is the main character. And she kind of has human emotions and is trying to figure out humans from the AI perspective, and is kind of a personal assistant to a kid. And that's the premise of the story. But it's really making me think about how cool it is if you have, this robot type of friend who has your needs in mind and can support you as a human throughout your life. I don't know what happens at the end, so I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I think there's a lot of exciting work that could be done here too. If we can obviously work towards these goal states and figure out some of the challenges along with them.
Yeah,
We talked a lot about that at the annual conference actually a couple of weeks ago with members, where we're trying to say we're not all just passive recipients of this future that is barreling forward. We're not just passengers on the train. We can think about where we want things to go. So that's really the Horizon reports and the Horizon action plans. That's really the basic spirit of those, which is, what do you want to see in the world and how can you make it happen? So I love that you brought that up, Sophie.
Yeah, and I think, Sandeep, I'd love to hear what you think too, as in a leadership position, and then also you're obviously a member of the EDUCAUSE board, and you're looking at EDUCAUSE and the future of higher ed technology and our profession from a strategic and planning standpoint as well. So I'm curious, what do you think maybe in terms of AI, or, are there other things that maybe we are not focusing on as much in terms of planning and we should be, but they're getting distracted by AI?
Well, let's say that there's enough on our plate. So I'm not worried about that. There should be more. We'll start with that. Prioritization, I think, is a big challenge. So just to respond to, as we look at what are we working on in EDUCAUSE and at our institutions as well, this has certainly added that additional stress that James was talking about, from senior leadership to folks in the faculties to even our students. And I love that idea of AI guilt. Guilt is a human thing, and now AI is just another thing that's added to our list of things that we feel guilty about, not spending enough time with our family and, not being there to support our teams. And that just is a human element, and no matter what we're dealing with, it's going to be there. So love that thought that James, you shared. I think one aspect I often think about is, someone mentioned this to me, and it was probably at EDUCAUSE in one of the presentations. I'm going to start with the scary part and then try to flip that half glass full, half glass empty. Half glass empty is, I heard from few presentations that where AI, in the absence of accurate data, can do so much harm and damage, and accuracy or just lack thereof. And when AI sometimes is in a space where if it cannot find the answer, it will create the source to build an answer. That is a scary space. What can we do? We can't stay away from it. We need to be in it to make sure that data governance, though, that control space. And by control, we are not talking about to influence in a negative way, but to have controls that we can feel confident about the outcome of the solution. Very similar if we flip this into our work environments when we talk about diverse teams. And often I've heard individuals say, that's a very certain type of dominated organization or team. I'm like, that's why you need to go there. You need to have a seat at the table to shift that. And I feel same with AI. There is a bias in there because there isn't data available, hasn't been collected. But if we shy away, guess what? We're now replicating the problem. So for me, I haven't started this work yet, but I'm really intrigued by this notion of what role can we play. And in fact, last night, I was going over the report, the EDUCAUSE report on generative AI. I really loved it. You did say don't prepare for this session, but I felt guilt. I want to show up. I want to be prepared. And there were some really cool ideas. And what I found very useful was this fact of, at an individual level, what you can do, as an organizational level, you can do. Because I think the responsibility is much more than an individual. What I'm hoping to do is I'm going to pick up one space that we're going to work towards. And that could be as simple as supporting, I know there are a bunch of research projects happening in AI. Now organizations is really supporting them. And the other aspect, we're looking at how can we leverage the power of AI in a positive way in our operational environment as well. Because I think there is huge benefit for us. And in fact, James, when you were talking about grad students, when I wrote my thesis, I wish I had AI. All the research I had to do, it sucked the life out of me. It's very, and I don't know, the effort spent in researching all those documents and books was actually the true value for me. And this is a grad student speaking, a personal opinion. The value was when I went in there and I did my analysis and found those insights, which was the product of my work. So I feel there are spaces like that that certainly can be useful in higher ed and beyond.
I like that you say and beyond, because I've been, as we're talking about all these things, I keep thinking about these showcase topics, and the greater good topic feels very appropriate for these other pieces that we've been discussing, because we're not just institutions isolated. We are part of a big wide world, and this feels like, I almost wish I could go back to that generative AI report and put like, how do we influence the future of generative AI in the world as well as at our institutions? But yeah, that greater good piece is striking for me here.
I love that. I mean, I think indirectly you are, because higher ed is obviously supporting the next generation of learners and citizens of the world. So there's a greater good element. But yeah, I love that you mentioned that. So if folks are unfamiliar, John O'Brien, our EDUCAUSE president and CEO, wrote an article in EDUCAUSE Review related to our new strategic plan, and the theme of it surrounds the greater good in higher education and how the strategic plan supports it. I think one thing I wanted to touch on too, which is in that article, is that at EDUCAUSE we're kind of going through this, what feels like a slight identity shift, where we were talking about ourselves as higher ed IT professionals before, and now we're moving to technology and data professionals, and just this idea that data is so paramount and foundational to everything we do, whether it's talking about, gathering data related to AI or elsewhere, and how that drives our actions. So I think there's a lot we can do with data to support the greater good, and obviously a flip side of it's dangerous too, and there are privacy and security concerns as well.
I have a question on that for James, and I just want to hear some of your thoughts. We're living in such a volatile world right now with things happening, and that's why I said beyond. We are not confined to the physical spaces, and the world is a very tiny space right now. And tensions around the world, percolate into our work, into our environments as well. And I was thinking about when I saw in the note greater good is becoming so complex and complicated in these situations. Because I think what we're dealing with is my personal value versus my peer versus the organization versus perhaps the space that I'm in, and so many more things. And I was thinking about, where does AI fit in? I don't have an answer. And is it, I am sure it plays a role. It's an information war in the end of the day.
Yeah. And so while you were talking about the greater good and better tomorrow, for whom, right? So specifically, who's greater good, what culture is going to be dominant? I'm working actually with another team that's trying to preserve dying languages and kind of offset the homogenization that we're seeing with English being the only dominant language and culture we're going to see in the future. So we need to kind of be aware of what's happening. But another thought, when you were talking about that, I just saw a report, and there was actually a Netflix documentary just came out as well that's playing on this fear of the Terminator kind of sentiment towards AI, in that we have AI and robots, and they're in war now. And an article came out yesterday is like, and the Ukraine is building once again drones that can fire and kill autonomously, etc. What happens if we do that? And I was at a conference, and someone actually asked me that. I'm like, well, that the president of the U.S. signed into law the ability for drones to make independent decisions as of January 1st, 2023. Right. And so we've already had almost a year of that. So the machines aren't the problem, right? As always, right? The data, how we train them, the machines are not biased. They're not anything. And so just thinking about the implications of whose data are we feeding it? What narrative of the world are we giving it, right? So Sandy, if you were talking about the indigenous peoples, that you're working with there, we're trying to do things like, capture those languages as well as be able to go back through AI cloning of historical figures and replicating historical locations to be able to converse with them in such a way. But again, that's very ethically loaded in such a way that, whose version are we using? How much primary sources do we have? The way in which it was at a conference, it was on Columbus Day. And I'm like, as an example, the way they taught me Christopher Columbus and Thanksgiving, in the 1980s is very different in school than how we teach him now. And so thinking about historiography and how these narratives change and how dependent upon our own current cultural perspective, dominant or not, that is. And all that's going to come together with AI because we're telling it this is the correct way. And I've talked to so many people of different political backgrounds. And of course, those on the conservative side were always upset that the way in which they trained OpenAI large language models, and there's a good reason for it, is slightly left-leaning, right? So it actually observes pronouns. It once again won't tell racist or sexist jokes, right? So they have these guardrails built in. We had one creative writing professor having it compare poems from 19th century authors on death, and it recommended a suicide hotline, right? So we built in these guardrails, that flag it, but it's based upon that particular worldview. And the reason why we built it in, of course, is if you think of Harvard's models and MIT's models in the early 2000s, they launched it within an hour, users trained it to be, a raving racist lunatic, right? So because of how they're reinforcing the type of language that it's using. And so in essence, the guardrails and our responsibility and everything, we need to be very aware and self-aware of, our own ethics and morals and what we're considering to be harmful or not harmful, based upon cultural relativism and other viewpoints. So
I just want to highlight one thing you said, James, really resonate with me, and we've talked about that on our campus a lot, very actively, is ownership of data when it comes to Indigenous communities. I think there's been some good and bad practices in the past, some intentional, some unintentional, but going forward, what role are we going to play, particularly when that research happens to reflect an Indigenous community, but they have no say in it, and how that data is utilized, and perhaps even sometimes in decision-making, in healthcare, in policy. It has far-reaching implications if we look at history. We don't have to look that far, how that data and information was used or abused.
I think there's clearly a lot of work for us to do in higher ed, but I do think that this conversation has inspired me in a way that as long as we are putting our value systems first, we're operating within the values that we hold dear in higher ed. If we're bringing a diverse set of voices to the table, if we're observing all of those sort of like basic human best practices, we can create the future we want to see when it comes to how higher ed is able to contribute to a greater good. What is the role that AI is playing? How can our institutions be resilient in these unprecedented, yes, I said it, unprecedented times of change? So yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it feels scary and exhausting because we have so much work to do. At the same time, there's hope. So we can take a balanced viewpoint on these things. I appreciate that about this conversation today.